Hi folks, happy Thursday. For those of you who have not met me yet, I am Educator Emily with ZooMontana. And if you have been following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any of our social media platforms, we've had sort of a theme going on. May's theme was animal adaptations. And so on Instagram, we've been talking about size as an adaptation with human-animal size comparisons. On Twitter, we've been talking about animal intelligence as an adaptation and different animal intelligence examples throughout the animal kingdom. And on Facebook, we've been talking about all of the really cool adaptations of the takin that we have at our zoo, which is a really unique goat-like giant antelope thing that lives in China and Tibet and Nepal, like in the Himalayan environments. So we've been talking about animal adaptations across our social media platforms all month. Now, from here on out, the last YouTube video of every month is going to focus on one of those themes that we were talking about on one social media platform. And this month, we're going to be focusing on animal intelligence here on YouTube. So we're kind of going to be going a little bit more in depth into the topic than our Twitter posts have been. We're going to learn a little bit more about the development of the field, what animal intelligence really means, and then we're going to talk about some examples of what we've learned from animals and about their intelligence, and then we're going to have some fun videos from some of the animals at our own zoo solving some intelligence puzzles. Now, when people think of animal intelligence, they typically exclude humans in that because we don't typically see ourselves as animals despite the fact that we are, and instead they tend to think of our closest relatives immediately, which are the primates. So you got your monkeys, you've got your great apes. They tend to think of those animals. And throughout this video, we're actually going to try and steer away from those animals just because they are so talked about and there's plenty of information on those already. And I want to kind of bring to light some of the animals that people typically don't think about when they think of animals having, smarts and intelligence. So before we can even get to that point in the video, we should set some definitions for some of the words that will be used throughout this video. First one being, let's put a definition to animal intelligence. So to do this, we're going to define two words. We're going to define cognition and we're going to define intelligence. So cognition is the mental transformation of sensory input into knowledge about the environment and then the flexible application of this knowledge. Intelligence refers to the ability to be able to successfully, flexibly apply that knowledge. Now, when people study the human brain, whether that be mental illness or intelligence, they are called psychologists. Now, there are people who do this with animals as well, and what are they called? They are called ethologists, or people who study animal behavior, much like psychologists and some anthropologists study human behavior. Those that study animal intelligence and animal cognition are also sometimes called cognitive ethologists. How do they study this? So ethologists aim to study animals in their natural environment as much as possible in order to understand the pressures on that animal that caused it to evolve the way it did. So they have to be able to understand how the animal interacts with its natural environment to be able to understand what evolutionary pressures might have been in place to give it the intelligence that it has today. In addition to a lot of field work, ethologists do also perform tests in a laboratory setting, but typically only after they have a deep understanding of how that animal interacts with its natural environment. Now, ethology in and of itself is a fairly old science. The practice of it has been around since about the 1800s, and it was kind of kicked off with the science and the writing of Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you guys have heard about, and if not, stay tuned for our next video on natural selection. We will talk a little bit about him. Well, a lot about him. However, ethology didn't really become modernized until about the 1900s, and this was thanks to three scientists in Europe: Nico Tinbergen, Konrad Lorenz, and Karl von Frisch. And all three of these scientists jointly won a Nobel Prize for their work in pioneering this field. So these guys all did separate work within the development of this field, but each of the foundations that they created are the basis for what modern ethologists do today. So Nico Tinbergen kind of created these four questions that govern the whole science of ethology. So his four questions have to do with the mechanism for the behavior, the ontogeny or the development of the behavior, the adaptations of the behavior, and phylogeny of this behavior. Konrad Lorenz, he studied birds mostly, so he's extremely famous for having little baby geese and baby ducklings imprinting on him and having them think that he was their parental figure. He also studied like the instinctive egg rolling behavior in mother geese when an egg rolls from the nest. And Carl von Frisch studied sensory perception in honeybees, and he's responsible for discovering the quote-unquote waggle dance that honeybees will perform for one another to give directions to the rest of the hive to where the nearest or best food sources might be. Ethology, and cognitive ethology especially, has really revolutionized how we see ourselves within the whole web of life. For a while, and it does kind of persist even now, people tend to think of there being a hierarchy in animals. We have your lesser animals, and then you have your highest animals, which tend to be humans. And this view came into being with Aristotle and his scale of nature. And here's an example of his scale of nature, and it's in this diagram formulated like a ladder, but it's the same concept. And you have humans at the top kind of being the pinnacle of life. Like, humans are as good as it can get, we are the ultimate creation. Whereas down at the bottom you have things like sponges and worms, your more quote-unquote lowly organisms. So this scale of nature basically classified the natural world so that it existed in sort of a continuum, with lower species at the bottom and higher or in species that were deemed more intelligent towards the top. And as we talked about with our phylogenetic trees, this is not the case. You have branching events every which way that signify that there's really no such thing as a lower or higher organism. But for a while, this scale view of the natural world kind of dominated the scientific sphere. And this is a little obviously problematic because this scale of nature classifies animals by human standards. And if it's anything that we've learned throughout history studying animals and studying animal intelligence, it's that you have to think like the animal to understand that animal. If you have been tuning into our Twitter posts, one of our first posts talked about the concept of an Umwelt, which is basically the animal's perception of its environment. So humans have evolved to perceive the environments that we live in a very specific way. Our senses are tuned to perceive that environment the way that best suits us. But we're not going to sense environments the same way a cat does, or a dog does, or a fish does. Their senses are developed and finely tuned for them to experience it in the ways that fit their own ecology and their own evolution. And so we have to be able to understand how the animal perceives its world, or its Umwelt, to fully understand how it functions in its environment and the functions of the behaviors it exhibits do. Like, why do they do what they do? In order to learn that, we need to understand their Umwelt. And this is the problem with the scale view of nature, is everything is kind of looked at through a human lens as opposed to getting down on the animal's level, if you want to put it that way. Now, when it comes to modern ethology and cognition science, the science of behaviorism kind of dominated the scientific sphere for a very long time. So ethology, the practice and the science itself, originated in Europe with Tinbergen, von Frisch, and Lorenz, whereas behaviorism kind of developed in the United States. And behaviorism is the theory that animal behavior is merely a response to stimulus, that there's no inherent motivation behind an animal exhibiting a behavior. For example, an animal isn't doing a behavior to manipulate something in its environment, it's doing the behavior in response to something happening in its environment. So this view of animal behavior kind of viewed animals as very passive. One of the big names in this behaviorism field is B.F. Skinner, and he's responsible for operant conditioning, bringing that into the scientific world. Operant conditioning is basically just learning through a series of either rewards or punishments. The animal then makes an association between a behavior and either the reward or the punishment. So let's say that, your cat successfully uses the litter box and you're like, oh my gosh, you're such a good cat, good job, and then you give it a treat. It's going to associate the behavior of successfully using the litter box with getting a treat. That is operant conditioning. So he's really famous for kind of pioneering this in a laboratory setting. So he didn't really do any field work. Everything that he did took place in a laboratory, much like you see in the top picture, him with a bunch of his pigeons. Now, he's extremely popular for creating this mechanism called a Skinner box, which is basically an enclosed area that includes a bar or a key or a button, something that the animal can press or manipulate for food and water as behavioral reinforcement. Behaviorism really used food and water as kind of these rewards for proper behaviors. They thought food was a big motivating factor for getting an animal to kind of do what you wanted it to do. But as the science of ethology grew in Europe, and once it spread to the UK, it kind of started to permeate American circles, the practice of learning about animals in their natural environment and understanding their behavior and the functions of that behavior in their natural environment really started to take hold. And people were like, hey, this is actually really neat. So, like I said earlier, ethology isn't completely done in the field. It is also conducted in laboratory settings. So they do use both. However, laboratory settings typically are not done without the complete understanding of how the animal functions in its natural environment. So the scientists still have that Umwelt back in their minds when they're studying animals in these laboratory settings. And by using that, they're able to tailor the laboratory tests to be as ecologically accurate as possible. Because habitat shapes the brain. As we've talked about with natural selection, the environment selects for traits that you see in animals today. And that includes, everything from the color of your fur to your brain and how you use it. Modern ethology also realizes that cognitive evolution is not on a scale with humans being at the top. It recognizes that it's marked by peaks in specialization. So while humans might be super great at creating languages and abstract thought, that could be our peak of specialization, but we can't echolocate, and our brains can't remotely fathom to begin to try to echolocate like a bat, or we don't have the impressive memory of a Clark's nutcracker that can bury hundreds of nuts in a season and remember the location of every single one of them. And we also don't have the amazing target accuracy of, say, an archer fish that has to be able to calculate the light refraction differences between water and air, successfully shoot a spray of water to get its prey. So that's its own specialization right there. The bat is its own specialization right there. The Clark's nutcracker is its own specialization right there. Those aren't really fitting on that scale view that we talked about earlier. It kind of looks more jagged like that. And so modern cognitive ethology recognizes that things don't happen on this nice scale view with humans at the top. It's more messy and jagged than we thought it would be initially. Another view that used to really prevail, and to some extent does today, was the idea that the bigger the brain, the smarter the organism. So if you had, a teeny tiny brain the size of a breadcrumb, clearly you were going to be a dumber organism than an animal with the size of our brain, for example. And that's not necessarily the case. What scientists recognize now is it's not so much the size of the brain that determines intelligence, but instead it's the number of neurons in the forebrain, which is the part of your brain that's kind of in the front of your skull, right here. So a lot of ethologists and scientists kind of think that the number of neurons or nerve cells that you have in this portion of your brain is going to be a decent determinant of intelligence. Now, that's not to say that the brain size idea has been completely thrown out the window, because in many cases, organisms with larger brains do tend to have higher levels of intelligence. And one of the hypotheses that may explain this is known as the social brain hypothesis. And this was originally developed by the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who's done amazing work with primates throughout his whole career. So this hypothesis was primate-centric, but you can kind of apply it to other groups like many current scientists have done. This hypothesis states that the primary selective force for large brains in primates, as well as advanced cognition in primates, was needed to navigate complex social interactions within their social groups, including humans. Our society is extremely complex. However, we are not the only social animals, and this hypothesis has thus been applied to other social animals with complex societies, such as toothed whales like orcas or dolphins, and spotted hyenas, to try and explain why they have such large brain to body ratios, as well as high levels of cognition. Now, this hypothesis doesn't say that just because you're a social animal, you are inherently smart, and thus if you're a solitary animal, well, you're just dumb. That's not what it's saying at all. It's just saying that we see in social species with complex societies these large brains, and it provides an explanation for that. However, solitary animals can be just as intelligent as social ones. And a great example of this is the octopus. Now, these marine invertebrates are basically completely solitary. But as science has learned in the recent years, octopi can be extremely smart. And in fact, in the wild, there's even been documented tool use, and it used to be thought that tool use was what defined humans as humans, and that kind of got thrown out the door when Jane Goodall discovered chimpanzees in Tanzania using tools. Octopi have also been recorded using tools. Specifically, they've been recorded using coconut shells, and I'll put the link to this video in the box below, but they use coconut shells as tools for ambush so they can hide to hunt their prey, and they also use them as potential protection from predators, which signifies planning and all these other things that are super cool to think about. So I'll put that link down in the box below for you. In addition, in captivity, octopi have also been recorded exhibiting play behavior, which is very common behavior that you see in animals with high levels of cognition. So for this last part of the video, we're gonna not only talk about some examples of animal cognition in animals throughout the world, but we're also gonna show some videos of the animals at ZooMontana exhibiting some of their cognitive abilities. So first, let's talk about one example of an animal out in the world. Let's talk about the sponging dolphins of Shark Bay, Australia. Now, this is a super cool behavioral phenomenon that's been observed for a while in this one population of dolphins in this bay in Australia. And what they do is they get sea sponges from the ocean floor and they put them on their rostrums, or their beaks. And they do this, it's thought, to prevent their beaks or their rostrums from getting all scraped up and damaged when they're foraging for food in the sandy bottoms of this bay. It's also been documented that this is a learned behavior. So it's specifically been transmitted mostly from mothers to daughters. So this is an example of social learning and an adult teaching a juvenile a beneficial behavior. And in fact, the dolphins that exhibit this sponging behavior have been found to have a higher foraging rate, or more successful foraging rate, than dolphins in the population that do not do this sponging behavior. And this is another example of tool use in the wild, which again used to be a human-only feature, and then we started to, explore more of the natural world and learn that we are not the only ones capable of using tools. Another example, a little closer to home, has to do with raccoons. Now, there is a scientist at the University of Wyoming. Her name is Lauren Stanton, and she runs this raccoon project at the university, and they study cognitive behavior of raccoons. This is a super cool project that's learned a lot of really neat things about these lovable trash pandas. Raccoons are a highly adaptable, very flexible species. You see them in mostly every environment throughout North America. And so she's been studying these raccoons in Wyoming, in Laramie, and she's been trying to see what these raccoons are capable of. So she's done laboratory tests with these raccoons where they were supposed to try and solve Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher, which is this famous tale where a crow finds a pitcher full of a little bit of water, but it's too far down for him to stick his head in to drink. And so he pops rocks into this pitcher to raise the water level so he can drink. And so what Laura Stanton did with the raccoons in Wyoming is she kind of set up this same scenario. She gave them a clear tube full of water, and they had little marshmallow bits floating on the top for the raccoons to be motivated to get. She also provided them with rocks or other materials of various weights and buoyancy, and tried to see if the raccoons would be able to to solve this puzzle to raise the water level up to the height in which that they could reach the little marshmallow bits. What she learned was that raccoons are extremely creative and extremely behaviorally flexible. So while not all of them, solved the fable, solved the problem to, put the rocks in to raise the water level, they came up with other ingenious solutions to retrieve that fun treat, as you can see in this third frame here, where it's literally standing on top of this tube to try and get it. Other raccoons rocked it back and forth and knocked it over, and some raccoons, plopped the rocks in, raised the water level, and were able to scoop the bits out. But the multiple methods of solving the same problem shows high behavioral flexibility and cognitive flexibility in these raccoons. She's currently using puzzle boxes to try and test their cognition behaviors a little bit more. And puzzle boxes typically have a food reward inside of them, and they have to be solved by manipulating a series of buttons or levers or pulleys to open the box to get the food inside. They can be spun, they can be flipped, they can be nudged, they can be opened with a flap door. There's a bunch of different ways to create a puzzle box or a puzzle feeder. So currently, that's what they are testing with the Raccoon Project at the University of Wyoming, is using these puzzle boxes to see how many problems they can solve to access food within these puzzle boxes. We used puzzle feeders at our zoo to kind of test the cognitive abilities of some of our animals. Now, you guys are going to watch puzzle feeding trials or enrichment trials with our domestic animals, so our goats, our alpacas, and our donkeys, and some of our chickens, as well as with Lurch, one of our turkey vultures. So animals that you don't typically think of when you think of intelligent, cognitive critters. And while these puzzle feeders might seem extremely simple to us, we have to remember the animal's Umwelt, or its perception of the environment. You have to think about how the animal would perceive this puzzle feeder. And these are often used as enrichment in zoos because they're a great way for animals to use their brains. Here we have our goats and our alpacas trying to solve a puzzle feeder. Now, the way this puzzle feeder is set up is it's basically an empty water canteen full of some of their favorite snacks, and it's got various holes throughout this canteen, and they have to be able to rotate or spin the canteen for food to fall out of the holes for them to retrieve. Now, this is a perfect puzzle feeder for goats because they use their heads a lot for navigating around their environment. They really don't have, hands or anything to use, so they butt at a lot of things with their head, which is exactly how they're supposed to manipulate this puzzle feeder here to get the rewards in which they want. Now, you can see the goat being fairly territorial over the puzzle feeder when it comes to the alpaca, who is curious but doesn't really quite know what to do. But the goats have it pretty well figured out. And there are different methods to solving this puzzle feeder. So some goats may lick the holes at the bottom to try and get the food to come out that way, whereas some might ram at it with their heads. Now, in the beginning of this video, Kramer, the alpaca who is navigating and investigating the puzzle feeder now, didn't quite know what to do, and he just kind of sat around and he watched the goats, and while the goats tried to butt him away. But after about 5 or 6 minutes of the exposure to this puzzle feeder, Kramer began to kind of put the pieces together and figure out that he has to rotate this puzzle feeder in some way in order to access the food inside. And so you can kind of see him start to explore the puzzle feeder a little bit more, coming to realize that if I rotate it, food falls out, but not quite getting to the point where he has to realize that he has to eat the food off of the ground in order for the reward to fully become accessible to him. But while he maybe didn't figure it out in the beginning, that doesn't mean that he wasn't smart enough to figure it out in the beginning. It was more of a watch and learn method. This is Lurch, one of our turkey vultures here at ZooMontana, and turkey vultures have an incredibly amazing sense of smell, and that's how Lurch is going to navigate the puzzle feeders that myself and Keeper Allison, who you can see in the background, gave him for this session. So what Keeper Allison is setting up is she's putting dead mice underneath these little containers so that Lurch cannot see what's underneath them, but he can smell what's underneath them. He must then lift that container lid up in order to access the juicy mouse inside. and he did just get a little bit of a hint from Keeper Allison that these do move, so now he was able to figure out that he has to kind of wedge his beak underneath it to lift up the lid to access the meat inside. After that little hint, though, he was able to figure out the rest of this puzzle feeder flawlessly. The second puzzle feeder that Lurch is receiving is a muffin tin with balls of various weights placed on the top. So it's a similar concept to the one prior, except he has to be able to roll the balls aside in order to access the meat within the muffin tin. And it isn't always that easy to figure out. Now, this muffin tin puzzle trial came after the puzzle trial where he had to lift off the white containers to get the mice. So by this point, Lurch had probably had at least 3 or 4 mice to munch on, and as a result was really no longer motivated to get to the mice that were still hiding in this muffin tin. But when Lurch called it and he got bored with the muffin tin, that's fine. We ended the trial. We did not make him try and retrieve the rest of the mice. Here we are back in our barn with another puzzle feeder, but this time for our domestic chickens. Now with this puzzle feeder, they have to not only figure out how to get the food inside, but they must figure out how to knock the puzzle feeder over. This is a very similar puzzle feeder to the one that was used in the alpaca and goat puzzle feeder trial. Once they have figured out how to knock the puzzle feeder over, they then have to figure out how to spin the puzzle feeder to let the food fall out of the holes that are cut within the sides. As you can notice, this is a flock of chickens, and not every chicken is going to get access to the puzzle feeder just because of the way that their flock society is structured. So you'll see the little white chicken and the darker colored black and gold chicken hang back a little bit more than our 2 red chickens. And this doesn't mean that those chickens aren't smart, it just means that they don't have a high enough social rank to access this puzzle feeder as often and as frequently as our other 2 chickens. Chickens are one of those animals that people commonly perceive as dumb, but as this puzzle feeder experiment shows, these chickens are capable of solving a simple problem and figuring out how to get a food reward. I hope that you guys enjoyed watching all of our critters solve some puzzle boxes, puzzle feeders, to get the rewards inside. Luckily, those were amazing days for filming. We had no issues with the animals trying to solve those puzzle feeders. Could have gone, extremely differently. They could have shown absolutely zero interest in those puzzle feeders, and this video would be a lot different if that was the case. But luckily, they were all very curious and wanting to participate in these trials. And that's another key thing that ethologists have to keep in mind when they're studying animals, is if the animal doesn't want to perform the behavior, you can't force it to do so and get an accurate result. The animal has to want to do the behavior you're asking it to do. And luckily, all of our critters at the zoo for this video were more than willing to participate in these puzzle feeder activities. If there's anything that the science of modern ethology has taught us, is that there's really no need to figure out what makes us human. Instead, we need to figure out how we fit into this global evolutionary lens for cognition. This will allow us to have a deeper understanding about the evolution of cognition across species. And that's what we're really trying to find out, isn't it? Alright guys, thank you for tuning in to this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed the little quick summary of animal intelligence and ethology as a field. Next month, across all of our social media platforms, the theme is animal mothers and parenting. So make sure that you're following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook to get all the really cool information on that. Here on YouTube for the month of June, we are going to be focusing on the modes of selection. So a couple weeks ago, we had our modules on evolution and phylogeny, and we're going to delve a little bit more into how that happens. Specifically, we're going to have one video focusing on natural selection, one video focusing on sexual selection, and one video focusing on kin selection. And of course, at the end of the month, we're going to have a themed video talking about our social media theme throughout the month of June. So make sure that you are tuned in to see those videos as they drop on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Again, I am Educator Emily. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week, and I will see you next week for our natural selection video. Bye, everybody.